Alors, merci beaucoup, François. Welcome. I'm going to run through some of what we are seeing in the world. We have a very interesting change that is happening globally, we think. And so I will try and describe that. You heard a little bit about my background. That's my White House uniform. This is a little bit more the Silicon Valley outfit here. I spent 7 years now building Singularity University. 2 years before that as the head of innovation at Yahoo. And I found, similar to John Hagel's talk, who's a good friend and colleague, that when you try and do disruptive innovation in a big company, the immune system of the company will come and attack you. Right? All of our organizations are built to withstand change and withstand risk. And now we're seeing that is actually the high order driver to what we're seeing. I spent 10 years here in Europe restructuring large European companies. Accor Hotels here, Groupama, Wagon-Lit, je parle français pas complètement couramment, mais je peux comprendre une conversation. But large French companies do not like to be restructured, which is why I'm bald, I think. This is a thing. Okay, you know, you will find that we are technology optimists. We believe that technology is a major driver of change in the world, maybe the only major driver of change that we have ever seen. And we are very excited with what is happening today. This is just the last 100 years of how dramatic our progress has been out in the world. We are based at NASA in Silicon Valley. And we got initial funding from these groups of people to get started. And we live off this particular curve. Ray Kurzweil put this chart together, and he found that Moore's law has actually been going all the way to 1900 in a very steady, predictable way. And the question that he asked is, why is that curve so predictable and so rhythmic? We've had wars, recessions, ups and downs in the semiconductor industry. You should expect much more of a stock market shape to it. And he spent about a decade doing research on this, trying to understand why this was the case. And he came up with a very fundamental observation. Once you take a domain or a discipline or an industry or a technology and you power it with information technologies and it acquires information properties, its price performance starts doubling. And once that doubling pattern starts, it does not stop. It just keeps going. And so very extraordinary outcomes. Peter Diamandis, how many of you have read Abundance? Okay, a few of you, Bill Clinton just called it one of the 2 most important books that he has read. Peter assesses that if we can harness this pace of change effectively, we could soon have an abundance of healthcare, energy, clean water, education in about 10 years. And what would the world look like if that was the case? We are now seeing the doubling pattern that we saw in Moore's law in all of these technologies. You heard a little bit about AI, Internet of Things this morning. All of these technologies are now doubling about 1 to 2 years in their price performance. And we have brought together the world's leading experts in those areas. And we spend 80% of our curriculum teaching the future. Most academics think about the past, right? How did this model evolve? How did this equation develop? We complement traditional academics and think about where will this go. When we have the $100 genome, what applications become enabled? Where are these technologies intersecting, et cetera? Our mission statement is, how can we apply these technologies to solve the biggest problems in the world? For the first time in the history of humanity, we can apply advanced technologies to global challenges. We have actually never been able to do that before. And we challenge our students to come up with ideas that will impact 1 billion people within 10 years. You have 3 weeks, off you go. And then we launch those as NGOs, for-profit companies, research ideas. This team from a few years ago was looking at poverty. They noticed that in Africa, most of the roads get washed out during the wet season. How do you alleviate poverty if you can't move anything around? Chris Anderson from Wired magazine came and did a talk on drones. We're very familiar with these now. And they had the idea, why not use drones to move medicine and food around, especially where there are no roads. There's a live test from Haiti where they're delivering medicine to a camp. Now, these drones today can carry a 4-kilo package about 10 kilometers. That is the range and capacity. But the underlying technologies are moving so fast that they are doubling in their capability every 9 months. Okay, so early next year, it's 8 kilos. By the end of next year, 16 kilos, and that just keeps going. And so we're teaching them to spot these doubling patterns, layer solutions on top of it. The solutions will then scale. You may have seen this announcement from Amazon. They want to deliver packages using drones. This was inspired in part by our project. By the way, when they made this announcement, they had no such capability. They managed to get this story onto 60 Minutes, a major American TV show, the day before Cyber Monday, which is their biggest shopping day of the year. So their marketing people were very happy. They've since put considerable investment into it. Here's the latest news from this team. They are now delivering mail for the Swiss Postal Service. And we're seeing the extraordinary explosion of uses of drones in other places. Here's another one of our projects. This team launched a 3D printer up to the space station. Ironically, up at the space station, there's no space. It's full of extra spare parts because if a valve goes bad, you'd better have a replacement. And so they launched a 3D printer there. We printed about a month ago the first man-made objects not made on the surface of the Earth. So interesting inflection point. We've launched about 70 such projects, each attempting to make a very dramatic impact in the world. We do shorter programs as well. 1 week investor, CEO, government leaders. This is maybe the most interesting one that we do. 4 days, we bring together CEOs of the Fortune 500. You can see some of the logos there. 2 days on these technologies, 2 days on what should you do about it. We asked them beforehand, how aware are you of some of these breakthroughs? And you can imagine most had very little awareness. Half of the rest were probably exaggerating. At the end of the 4 days, we asked them, how big of an impact will this have on your industries? And we gave them a timeline of 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 years, and a severity scale of low, medium, high, game-changing impact. 80% of them agreed that these technologies would have a game-changing impact on their industries within 2 years. Okay? 100% within 5 years. So that's the gap that we are trying to bridge. Most people have very little awareness. When they do, there's a French word called merde, and then you need to do something with it. Okay, maybe the most interesting attribute of our model is we update our curriculum in real time. We actually update every few months we convene our faculty and we revisit every lecture. And we found that we change our content about 20% every 3 months or so just to keep pace with this pace of change. So we are seeing, and you're all very aware that we are digitizing the world, right? We have 11 billion internet-connected devices out in the world today. Soon we'll have 1 trillion. And that one statistic I find extraordinary, 11 billion today to 1 trillion. We think we're 30, 40 years into the information revolution. On this statistic, we're about 1%. We're literally just starting. Most of this disruption is actually ahead of us. And we have found when we digitize something, we can then manipulate it with software. This team out of Israel, Beyond Verbal, can take a 10-second clip of your voice, and just by analyzing the tonal variation, can assess your mood and your underlying attitude to about an 85% certainty. Right? So you can try this out on your spouse if you want to have an interesting discussion about it. You can download this app called Moody's. I predict that with technologies like this and cameras recording facial twitches, in about 4 or 5 years, it will be impossible to lie. Okay? So if you're in marketing, you have to be a bit careful. If you're a politician, completely changes the game everywhere. And what will society look like? We will never have seen that in the world before. Right? I don't have time to go through all of these technologies, but we have found that when we have something that becomes digitized, the best analogy we have found for that is photography. Many of you are not old enough to remember film photography, but you're operating on a material substrate. Right? And you're operating from a scarcity model. You can only carry so much film around. It costs €1 a photograph. It takes a few days to get your prints back, etc. When you move to digital photography and you go to the information-based environment, 2 or 3 very important things happen. The first is the marginal cost goes to 0. Now you can take 1,000 photographs, cost is the same. The second, as a result, the domain explodes. We now take billions of photographs as opposed to taking just a few. The third thing that's very subtle, that's very important, is you shift the problem space. So in a scarcity problem space, I'm taking courses in photography so I can optimize every photograph I learn about composition, etc. In an abundance problem space, we all have 8 copies of our photographs on 10 different devices, and you simply can't find it, right? Because it's buried in everything else. So we shifted the problem space. And this explosion that we've seen in photography, we are now seeing across all of these technologies where we are going from scarcity to abundance. And technology is something that very steadily and very predictably moves something from a scarcity to abundance. We have seen that throughout history. How many of you are familiar with Baxter? Can I just see a show of hands? So Baxter is a stock-picking robot. You move its arms to show it what to do. It then uses image processing, video recognition to do the job from then on. This is a huge inflection point in robotics. In industrial robotics, you always had to prescriptively program the robot. You had to say, pick up this widget, turn 90 degrees, move over here, turn back, etc. With Baxter, it's adaptive. It uses, you move the arms, and it then does it from then on. Does not require programming. It takes about 25 minutes to train. Okay? It only costs $22,000. Does not unionize, does not take breaks, doesn't get sick, mostly. Right? This fellow's smiling, but it's about to take his job. Basically, that's where we're going, right? And to give you a sense of this, the really expensive part of Baxter is this red $10,000 arm, moves in 17 degrees of freedom, has a ton of actuators and so on built in. This is Saul Griffith, one of our faculty. He is building a replica of that using pneumatics and compressed air. He can do 95% of the functionality of the $10,000 arm, except this costs $35. And we see this steadily. Every time we see a step change in innovation, it is orders of magnitude off the price. The first version of the Google car cost about $300,000 a car in all the sensors, LiDAR, GPS, radar sensors. And everybody discounted it, saying that's a toy, it will never become scalable or commercial. The second version 2 years later was about $75,000 a car. Today, it's down to $1,000 a car. And now it's very interesting. Right? And so we see this steady pattern, very rapid exponential pace. In neuroscience, the real explosion is in the ability to image the brain, that the resolution of our imaging is doubling every year. And we can get today $100 headsets that give you quite a good fidelity readout of your brain. This is a team called Dreamcatcher. You go to sleep in an MRI machine. While you are asleep, they are storing the images coming off your visual cortex. And their objective is to play your dreams back to you the next day. Right? My wife wants to get her hands on that. I'm less interested in that, and you can see the delicacy where this goes. And that's the reading part of the brain. Today we have new technologies like optogenetics, where I can write to the brain and change somebody's neurons just by shining a light on it. Right? So very crazy implications of this. In biotech, maybe the most extraordinary thing that we're seeing, we've learned how to read DNA exceedingly well. It cost $2.7 billion to sequence the first human DNA in 2000. The second one was about 400 million, third one 50 million, fourth one about 14 million. Anybody know what it is today? It's $1,000. We've gone from almost $3 billion down to $1,000. By next year, it will be $100. By 2020, it will cost about a penny. By the end of the decade, it will be cheaper to sequence your genome than it will be to flush your toilet. Right? And when you flush your toilet, we'll probably sequence everything that goes through there because it'll be an interesting thing to do. That is a $10 million high-speed sequencing machine that is now reduced to this. And so we're seeing extraordinary changes of that. Now we're starting to write DNA. And when you write DNA, you change life forms. There's a team working on the woolly mammoth. We're a few years away from a live woolly mammoth wandering around. It'll be a bit confused. Its habitat will have changed quite considerably. This is teams of college students getting together to hack DNA in interesting ways. This winning team took the DNA in jellyfish that glows in the dark, crossed it with the DNA of a cat, and you can buy this pet that glows in the dark. Cat's not very happy, it can't hide anymore, and you can see this. And you can do this today in your bedroom. The technologies are so cheap. This is an open source hackerspace near us that we partner with. The girl in the middle there is 8 years old, and she's leading the DNA synthesis class. Okay? It turns out she's really good at holding the pipette at the right angles. She's teaching the adults how to do it. Part of the reason that we exist is how do you convey to that 8-year-old girl the moral and ethical implications of what she is doing? When I was that age, I was playing with chemistry sets, and the worst I could do is blow up the garage. She can change life on the planet. Right? And so the power of these technologies, we need to figure out how to modify. Here's one of our companies trying to take advantage of it as they are growing beef in a petri dish in a lab as opposed to hacking it out of a cow. Right? We use 70 billion farm animals a year for meat processing. If the middle class grows as expected, we will need to double that in the next 20 years, and just that might destroy the climate. And so they're working on that right now. It tastes terrible today. Our joke is the taste is doubling every year, so we'll see how that actually works out. This company just got approval 3 weeks ago. It's called the Arctic apple. They have found the single gene in the apple that when you bite into an apple has it oxidize and turn brown. And they've turned it off. So you can bite into that apple, leave it on the table for 4 days, it doesn't turn brown. Right? Maybe you can't tan after that. I don't know what the implications are of that. Okay, the really crazy part is now we're seeing things like the microbiome. We have 10 trillion cells in the human body, but it turns out we have 100 trillion bacteria inside our gut, about 1 kilo. And it turns out that more and more who you are is a carrying case for the bacteria inside you. Right? We are much more that. Bacteria could produce more than half of the dopamine coming through our brain. So we're very integrated into it. About a year ago, this story came out saying maybe we could use bacteria to solve diabetes. And 2 weeks ago, they found by swapping gut diabetes, we can cure type 2 diabetes. So we're going to see profound changes in this, in healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. Probiotics is a crude version of this. The more sophisticated version is called fecal transplants. And I'm just going to leave it right there. Okay. Lately, we've now seen this new technology called CRISPR, where we can now edit a genome as easily as you can copy and paste in a Word document. The Chinese just announced they are now editing embryos in the womb. And so this has all the bioethicists freaking out because the implications of this are very, very profound indeed. Okay? So again, I don't have time to go through all of these, but all of these technologies are moving incredibly fast. The higher level implications are quite incredible. How many of you have heard of the Tricorder X Prize? Anybody? So Peter has a $10 million prize for literally the Star Trek tricorder. And somebody will win $10 million when their handheld diagnostic device can beat 10 doctors in doing a diagnosis. Right? So that's the challenge. When your handheld device can outperform 10 doctors, you win $10 million. 300 teams have been competing for this. We are down to the last 8. The winner will be announced in December. So by the end of this year, we will have a handheld device that will beat most doctors. That will completely change healthcare. Right? Imagine in developing countries where you have a doctor per million citizens, how transformative that will be. If you're a hypochondriac, you will love this gadget, right? In fact, you'll buy 2 of them because one must be wrong, you can't be that healthy, et cetera, et cetera. Pretty extraordinary implications of this. Here's the leading contender called Scanadu. This is a Belgian company. That's a whole examination room in the size of a pillbox. But maybe the most dramatic thing that we are seeing today is solar energy. It turns out that solar energy is doubling in its price performance and has been for about 30, 40 years, doubling every 22 to 30 months. At this pace, we will hit 100% of world energy supply deliverable by solar in about 23 years. Okay? And importantly, because it's on a doubling pattern, in 25 years we hit 200%, in 27 years we hit 400%, in 29 years we hit 800%. Right? So we expect actually an abundance of energy fairly shortly. It turns out if you add up all of the oil reserves, coal, natural gas in the whole world and add that adds up to 5 days of sunlight hitting the world. So you shift the conversation from a scarcity problem to a conversion problem. And that conversion is riding this doubling pattern. Here's the relative cost of solar to a series of other technologies. Next year, it will be cheaper than the US grid. And we'll see a huge investment inflection point into it. This is the last 5 years of solar, and you can see the extraordinary change right there, how it's dropping off a cliff. Right? And so very profound change, huge geopolitical issues, right? The Middle East will essentially collapse. The US will have to find other reasons to go to war, all sorts of kind of crazy implications as a result of this. So the disruption, though, I can go on about the technologies for a long time, very sexy, lots of cool videos, but fundamentally we are not ready for this pace of change. All of the mechanisms that we use to run the world, our civics, our politics, our legal systems, healthcare, education, intellectual property, all designed for a world a few hundred years ago, not for today. Definitely not for 1 trillion sensors coming down the pike. We will actually need to re-architect every single structure that we have in society today. And so this is the challenge. And I'll give you a sense of this. You've all heard of the Google car. Could I get a bit of volume for this, please? Let's see if this works. This is a video of what it's like to ride in the Google car.
Oh my goodness, go.
I don't have volume. We're going to go down here.
Holy shit.
There's a bit of swearing. I apologize.
Holy shit. There's no fucking hands on that wheel. Oh my god.
Sorry.
What? It's driving itself. Ah!
All right. You got the general idea. That scream, that is the visceral scream of humanity meeting advanced technology. Okay? That is the scream of the taxi drivers wondering what to do about Uber. Okay? Okay? That is the scream. Okay? We all have at the back of our brains an old organ called an amygdala. And it's an organ that we developed evolutionarily when we were on the plains of Africa. If there was a noise in the bushes, you ran because bad news could kill you. Today, bad news doesn't kill you, but we are actually, as a result, we are 10 times more likely to listen to bad news than we are to listen to good news, right? Which is why Fox News in the US does so particularly well. If you watch Fox News, you're going to die today. And if you're really lucky, you'll last till tomorrow, but then you'll die tomorrow, right? That's essentially, and they're tickling that amygdala. Our horror movies do the same thing. They tickle the amygdala. And what we are seeing around the world today is the amygdala of society is freaking out. Because our old way of protecting society is simply not compatible with that. And today there's all sorts of issues with cell phones and drugs and money being dropped behind prison walls. And today we have this huge issue. The Prime Minister of Turkey a few months ago said social media is a menace to society. That is his amygdala freaking out, right? The US response to Edward Snowden is the amygdala of the US freaking out. And so we actually need to figure out how to program away from that. And we used to use top-down regulatory structures and legal frameworks to control society. But when technology is so democratized that you don't have ability to do that, what do? This team has figured out how to inject, I know we've just finished lunch, but here's a guy getting an injection right into his eyeballs. This is what he looks like afterwards, and he now has night vision, okay? Now you cannot pass a law to control that, right? It's just gonna happen. People will just do it because people are crazy, and how do we deal with that? So this is the structural issue. Every regulatory mechanism is now going to break down as we go forward in the future. From an economic perspective, we're seeing a couple of things. We see that when we fully digitize an industry from one end to the other, we have huge deflationary dynamics taking place. The newspaper business trundled along, all of a sudden 6x drop in revenues as eBay, Craigslist, and so on hit. This is the music business, 10x drop in revenues. The US television business is hitting this cliff right now and falling off a cliff in terms of revenues. And here's the fundamental problem. All of our intuition and all of our training about the world is linear. We are very good at predicting linear approximation. If I take 30 linear steps like this, 1 to 30, I'll get to the back of the room. We can all predict very well where would I be a third of the way or 2/3 of the way in that progression. If I take 30 doubling steps, 2, 4, 8, 16, etc., and I get to step 30, I've gone 1 billion meters. I'm 26 times around the world, okay, which is a bit further than the back of the room. And it's hard to gauge where am I a third of the way or 2/3 of the way in that progression. And more of the world driven by information is riding that green curve and not the linear approximation. So if you do not spot that curve early, it will disrupt you very badly. If you spot it early, it's the biggest advantage you could ever have. How many of you had heard of 3D printing 5 years ago? Can I just see a show of hands? Okay, 10 years ago? Okay, 15 years ago? 3D printing is actually 35 years old. It is not a new technology. But when you're doubling in your price performance, say 0.001 widgets per hour, and 2 years later you double that to 0.002, and 2 years later you do double that to 0.004, and 0.008, and 0.016, it takes a long time to get to 1. Right? Then it goes 2, 4, 8, 16, it takes off, and then we say, oh, black swan. Okay? In fact, you could call us Black Swan University. Can we spot these disruptive trading patterns? And here's how badly we get it wrong. Vinod Khosla did this analysis of the exponential growth in mobile phones throughout the 2000s. And he asked the question, how well did the mobile industry expert analysts predict that pace of change? So in 2002, he went and looked at Gartner, Forrester, Jupiter, McKinsey's, et cetera, and found they predicted 16% annual growth. 2 years later, gone up 100%, so they're off by quite a bit. Yet their prediction was 14%. 2 years later, went up another 100%, their prediction was 12%. And you can see what's happening here. When you have exponential growth, the experts in that field will predict linearly. Right? In fact, in 2008, unable to spot 3 doubling patterns in a row of 100% growth, their prediction was 10%. And then it went up another 100%. How much more wrong can you be from 10% to 100%? You're 10 times off. This is not a math error. This is a cognitive issue. And we're now information enabling all sorts of old assets. Right? If you have a car, it sits empty 96% of the time, and Uber is enabling that. If you have an extra bedroom, Airbnb is enabling that with the confluence of reputation systems payment systems, GPS, BlaBlaCar here in France doing the same thing. Peter Thiel invested in Airbnb at a valuation of 40% of that of Hyatt Hotels 2 years ago. Here's how their room nights have continued on an exponential path. They recently had 500,000 rooms occupied in one night around the world. At this pace, Airbnb will be the biggest hotel chain in the world by the end of this year. And they don't own any hotels. What a cool business to be in. You're the market leader, none of the legacy costs. I'll come back to that. We are now seeing anywhere where there's episodic use of an asset, we will turn it from a product to a service. We all own at home a screwdriver for the millionth of a percentage of the time that we use it, right? At some point in the future, if you need a screwdriver, a drone attached to a cell phone tower will fly it to you. And so we're going to see very radical changes in business model. And the fundamental driver is the democratization. Because these technologies drop in cost, it means everyone and anyone has access to these technologies. And what we see steadily across all of these domains is you see a domain becomes information enabled or digitized, the cost drop, open source communities form, technologies intersect, and then you have massive disruption. This is Emiliano Cargiman, one of our alumni. He's Argentinian. He's been voted by our faculty the most likely to actually impact 1 billion people. What Emiliano is doing is launching nanosatellites. They're about the size of a shoebox. Once he has a mesh cluster of them up in space, he will be able to do real-time video, okay, real-time video anywhere in the world to a 1-meter resolution. We will never lose another Malaysian airliner, for example. Okay? And so quite extraordinary. Now, importantly, before he did this, he had no experience in the space industry. And we are seeing today entrepreneurs with a beginner's mind leveraging new technologies, attacking legacy industries with impunity. Elon Musk may be the best example of that. Has no experience in the space industry, car industry, energy industry, and yet he's creating market leaders in all of them, right? He got annoyed that the California Transport Board approved a $70 billion high-speed rail system, and he designed the Hyperloop. Anybody here familiar with the Hyperloop? It's a high-speed rail system that uses repurposed oil pipelines to shoot people in pods down it at about 3,000 kilometers an hour. So you could get from San Francisco to LA in about 20 minutes, right? At about a few thousand kilometers. And to give you an indication, I was chatting with him about this, and I said, Elon, my degree's in theoretical physics. If you accelerate somebody from 0 to 3,000 kilometers an hour and then decelerate them, you'll probably kill them, right? And he said, yeah, it's an issue. Okay? And there is the mind of a great entrepreneur. For me, it seems an impossible problem. For him, it's an issue. And this is the change that we have to make. Okay? Now, in France, we are very good at saying something is impossible. Right? So be careful about that. All right. Maybe the most disruptive thing I've ever seen is Bitcoin. It's a great ecosystem, et cetera, but really the underlying blockchain is the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen. For me, this is the most disruptive innovation I've ever seen, because it allows for decentralized authentication. Right? A bank is essentially a centralized authenticated ledger, and we trust our life savings to that centralized system. When you can decentralize the authentication, you don't need the bank. Okay? In fact, if you're an auditing accounting firm, your audit function is essentially authenticating transactions. That entire audit function will disappear in a few years as we create new systems around this. And there's a whole series of systems, voting systems, transaction logs, multi-signatory contracts, et cetera, that will all dissolve to this decentralized structure. A very, very powerful system here. In the Q&A, I can explain why this is so disruptive. Bitcoin, I would place about there. We've seen new technologies converging. We're waiting for the new products and services to come out. And this pace of change is not slowing down. If this was really an exponential curve, it would be linear, but actually it's tilting upwards. Okay? If we went back to 2010, we had about 2 billion people online. We have 2.8 billion people online today, and we'll have 5 billion people online by the end of this decade. 3 billion new minds are coming online this decade. The biggest marketplace in the history of humanity is being created underneath our noses, and they will all have access to one of these. This is the new Indian Akash tablet. It's a 1 gig Android tablet with Bluetooth camera, phone, etc. The manufacturing cost of this is 10 euros, right? And it's dropping in price 50% a year. In a few years, we'll be giving this out in cereal boxes because you won't be able to sell anything to those people if they don't have one of these, right? And if you're familiar with the Google Loon project, can I see a show of hands? Anybody? Quite a few of you. So Google is launching these high-altitude balloons. Facebook has its drone program. I love this statistic. Next, when they announced this project 2 years ago, there were 2 buckets of people that said this would be a disaster. The first was the balloon experts who said, look, a balloon goes up, the material freezes, cracks appear, comes down. No balloon stays up for more than a few weeks. You're crazy to try this. We're balloon experts. It's what we do. The second were the telcos who said you can't do broadband from that high. The power requirements are too high. The equipment will be too heavy. 2 years later, the balloons are staying up for 200 days at a time, and they're delivering 40 megabits a second of broadband. Right? So very profound. So very soon, by the 2020, we'll have 5 billion people online with free internet access globally. And that will be an interesting change in the world. Okay, so what do you do about that from a business perspective? We've seen now we're digitizing every aspect of the business life cycle. How do you take advantage of this? How do you make sure you don't get disrupted by these startup entrepreneurs? This is the quote that struck me very forcefully a few years ago. David Rose, one of our faculty, made this comment. And you heard this from John Hagel. All of our businesses are built for efficiency, predictability, and to maintain the status quo, not for disruption. We need to change the heuristic on which we run our organizations. I wrote this book, came out 6 months ago. We've identified a new breed of organization structure that I call exponential organizations. And I found that these new organizations are operating at a minimum 10x performance improvement compared to their peers in the same space. Right? Many of you are familiar with Quirky. It's in the CPG business or retail world. If you're Johnson & Johnson or Procter & Gamble, it takes about 300 days to go from a new idea to product on a Walmart shelf. Okay? Quirky does that same process, new idea to product on a Walmart shelf in 29 days. Unheard of in an old industry. We've now spotted about 100 such organizations operating at this 10x performance improvement. Okay? If you're BMW or Peugeot or Renault, it costs about $3 billion to create a new car model from scratch. Local Motors does that for $3 million. So that's almost 1,000 times better performance. And so the question, TED is a great example of this, a nice high-end conference doing 1,000 people a year at Monterey. Chris Anderson took it over. He did 2 things. He released all the TED Talks for free, and he allowed anybody to go create a TEDx event, leveraging community. Right? In 5 years, he's created a global media brand. Nobody has ever created a global media brand so fast, and his cost was pretty much zero. Okay? And so that's what's possible. And the question is, what goes into this? So half the book is looking at what are the elements that go into building one of these, and I'll describe them very quickly. The first is they all have what I call a massive transformative purpose. Like Google, organize the world's information. Okay? It's a very aspirational tagline. A community forms around it. You create a gravity well of interest. You deliver social purpose, etc. Quirky is make invention accessible. Singularity is go impact 1 billion people positively. Coca-Cola has just taken on one of these. Coke's new mantra is open happiness. Right? Not sell sugar water through highly specialized distribution chains and superior vendor networks to an ecosystem of value-added da-da-da-da-da. It's literally open happiness. If you're running any large organization, most of your employees do not know what your mission statement is. Right? But everybody in Google knows organize the world's information. And it changes the politics from internal politics to external delivery. It changes the focus. It's much easier to retain talent. So we're seeing more and more organizations operate like this. And we're seeing brands, as I mentioned, morph into this. Then we're seeing 5 externalities to scale outside the core organization. Our old way of building a business was to get an asset or a workforce, put a legal boundary around it, and sell access to scarcity. That's essentially how we've been building businesses, right? The new model is to keep a small footprint and tap into an abundance outside you using technology. Note that the mission-critical function in Uber, which is to match driver to passenger, does not happen inside the organization. It happens out in the wild. And that allows them to scale very, very effectively. So Uber does not employ its own staff yet. TED uses community, Google uses algorithms, Airbnb uses other people's bedrooms, etc. Then they have 5 internal mechanisms to manage in a completely different way, whether it's the lean startup methodology or real-time metrics. One of my more interesting ones is autonomy. These new organizations operate without the traditional hierarchy silo that we have seen. How many of you are familiar with Valve software out of Seattle? 400 people in Seattle. No CEO, no reporting lines, no job descriptions, no management meetings, no middle management layers of any kind. They operate like a beehive. So if I find a bug, I find 3 people that might solve it. We go solve the bug and we disband. Everybody decides what they want to do. If I like that team, I'll join them. If I like that team better, I'll join them. They get more revenue per employee than Microsoft. Okay? And to give you an idea of how scalable this is the Chinese company Haier, 80,000 people making 55 million fridges a year. Okay? 10 years ago, the CEO looked at his organization and said, I cannot meet my corporate goals with this structure. Blew it up, turned 80,000 people into 2,000 autonomous teams, each choosing whatever they want to do. The teams vote on what features should go into the new fridge, so there's no central planning. Right? They've tripled their market cap as a result. And making 55 million fridges a year is not a minor thing. It's fairly operationally significant, right? So pretty extraordinary. What we've found is if you implement 4 out of these 10 attributes, you get the 10x performance improvement. Not everybody does all of them, but if you put 4 out of the 10, you get the 10x performance improvement. And I've created a survey that you can take on the website called, where you can score your own organization. It's free to take. You can actually come up with a score on how scalable is your org structure. Okay? But the bigger question, and half the book at the end, is what do you do if you're an existing company? Right? If the new world is moving this fast, what do you do? And we've got a few examples of what you should do. First is update your leadership that this is happening. We are in a completely new world of building businesses. And you are now, most big companies think their competition comes from other big companies. Not true. Your competition now comes from the entrepreneurs and startups in that space. Most organizations do innovation from the inside. If you're relying on innovation solely from within your company, you're dead going forward. You have to open up to some of the ecosystems, incubators, entrepreneurs around you. So be aware that there's, and you remember my statistic that I said from that other program. Maybe the most important is that you cannot take an existing big organization and turn it into one of these new exponents. It's too radical of a change. And you risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater. What you can do is take the disruptive change agents inside your organization, take them to the edge and have them build one of these on the edge. Okay? And John Hagel talks a lot about that. The master of doing this is Apple. Apple has built the most successful company in the world. Yes, they have a great design capability and they have a great technology supply chain. Their core innovation is an organizational one. Apple's real innovation is that they take a small disruptive team to the edge of their organization, they keep them totally stealth, and they say, go attack another industry. Nobody else does this. So they started with what? Music, and then phones, and then tablets, and now watches, payments, healthcare. There is no limit to their market cap. They can keep knocking over industry after industry. And now that we're in a world where either you're the disruptor or you're the disrupted, we think other big companies will have to do the same. If you're in financial services, the insights you have on all these other industries around you is quite profound. And how can you leverage and tap into that using this structure? Here's the epilogue of the book. This is the market cap of the top 10 exponential organizations from when I started writing the book to when I finished writing the book in 10 quarters. And you can see the multiplier there for this. And Uber and Airbnb have both doubled in the last 6 months. Okay? And here's the core economic thesis that emerged about halfway through writing the book. When you're running a business, you worry about managing costs of supply and costs of demand, right? You try and optimize around both sides of that equation. What the internet did for us, it allowed us for the first time ever to drop the cost of demand exponentially. Online marketing, referral marketing. If you get a viral loop, your acquisition costs go completely zero. What these new exponential organizations have figured out how to do is how do you drop the cost of supply exponentially, right? So Airbnb's marginal cost of adding a room to its inventory is almost zero. If you're Hyatt, you have to build a whole new hotel, right? Same with Uber. If you use Waze, the traffic application, which piggybacks on your GPS, when you join, your supply and your demand, right? Now, when you can drop the cost of demand exponentially, you take out the denominator, your market cap explodes. And that's why we're seeing these crazy valuations, right? Uber is now 50% of the US business ground travel expenses. 50% of business travel expenses in the US is now Uber, right? Exploding out of the gate. About 3 weeks ago, we ranked the Fortune 100 by their exponential score. I went on CNBC and made this announcement. We partnered with Holt Business Schools, who did an analysis of this. Here are the Fortune 100 ranked by their exponential score. You can see a lot of oil companies and so on at the bottom, and a lot of information-based businesses at the top. We actually found that your organizational scalability correlates to stock market performance. over time, the flexibility of your org structure will become a factor in your stock market performance. Okay? And let me end with this example. How many of you have heard of Soylent? Okay, a few of you, great. So Rob Reinhardt is a software developer out of New York City. He gets pissed off that he has to stop writing software to go eat. Typical developer type. Okay. And he decides, why can't I buy a shake that gives me a whole meal in one milkshake? And he looks around and he finds there isn't one. So he spends 4 months with biochemists and nutritionists, and he comes up with Soylent, which is 100% of the fats, carbohydrates, nutrients, minerals, vitamins that you need as a human being in a day. So you can drink this and take nothing else. People have now lived on it for 5 months without taking in anything else. They've lost a ton of weight. They're way healthier. They're a bit bored, right? But I could drink one of these and not eat anything, or eat whatever I wanted the rest of the day. I've got all my nutrition, right? And so fascinating what it can do. Here's the most dramatic thing. If you were 40 years old or over, you would patent that formula and you would make it available, license it, and make money off the licensing. This younger generation is different. He open sourced his formula. Anybody can go make it. There are already 1,500 variants on his recipe. And the most fascinating thing for me is he's running it like a software company. He's up to version 1.4. In fact, version 1.5 just released last week, which presumably has less bugs in it, or maybe more bugs in it, who knows. But we've now turned food into software. Okay? So we are in a fundamental inflection point in the world. Food, healthcare is now software. Energy is now software, driven by information-based algorithms and solar energy. Every major domain is turning into software and turning into information. And we need to re-architect it. And the reason that we are particularly interested in France is that you have a history here. You are the only country in the world that has successfully managed large-scale social engineering. And as we change this inflection point of the world, we will actually need large-scale social engineering. And you're the only country that has done it before. Impossible to work with, but there's an elegance of the architecture that you have, and I think you have an incredibly important role to play in the future. Right? So I think we have some time for questions. Thank you very much for your time having me here. Thank you.